If you've ever owned a Sonic Games collection disc, you've probably at some point played the Game Gear versions of classic Sonic games. I sure have, and there's one game in particular that has always stood out to me. That of course being Sonic the Hedgehog Triple Trouble, which I consider to be my favorite Game Gear game, and today's topic of discussion. Alright, without further ado, let's get into it. The game was developed by Aspect, originally under the alias of Sonic Chaos 2, later being renamed to Sonic the Hedgehog Triple Trouble, although both timeline and release-wise it is still a sequel to Sonic Chaos. Triple Trouble released worldwide in November of 1994, with a Japanese version of the game having a different name and box art compared to the American and European versions. Out of the 8-bit Sonic games, Triple Trouble is the only one that was developed and released only on the Game Gear handheld console, with the Master System release never seeing the light of day and the port being considered lost media nowadays. Here's some screenshots from the game, which show unused animations and cutscenes for the game that weren't included in the final product. Through unknown means, Dr. Eggman managed to obtain the 6 Chaos Emeralds, and after a failed experiment, manages to lose all but one of them. Sonic and Tails begin searching for the emeralds, while Eggman tricks Knuckles yet again to help him fight against Sonic. Seriously, it hasn't even been a month, dude. What is wrong with you? We're also introduced to a new character, Knack the Weasel, who has already managed to locate and obtain all the emeralds in the subspace, where this game's special stages take place in. You can play as either Sonic or Tails, with both having unique abilities and power-ups that help add some replay value to the game. Sonic has his super peel-out ability from Sonic CD, but it isn't that useful, as you sometimes take damage from enemies even if you go to ball form, and the spin dash is just overall faster. Tails can fly, but he isn't that fast when doing so, and he doesn't gain much speed when flying. It's still more useful than the super peel-out though. Sonic's rocket shoes from Sonic Chaos are back, and so is this giant spring power-up. Tails' flight power-up is practically the same as the rocket shoes, with the only difference being how it looks. Tails also gets this cool little submarine power-up. Sadly, you can only see it in action in Tidal Plant Zone. They can both go to ball form when launched up by a spring if the player presses the jump button mid-air, which is a really useful feature, especially when there might be enemies or ring boxes under you. I still can't believe how this didn't become a standard ability of Sonic. Gaining speed feels satisfying in this game, with the way you steadily pick up speed for the first few seconds, and the top speed you gain both feeling satisfying, and come close to emulating the 16-bit experience. Loop-de-loops are not as frustrating as they are in most other Game Gear games, but they still feel kind of janky if you don't go fast enough. You should always stop and spin dash when approaching one, just to be sure. You can run on water by jumping or running fast enough, which is great because being underwater in this game is not fun. The checkpoint boxes from the first Sonic Game Gear game also make a grand return in this game. Now, a major quest for the player throughout the game is to get the 5 Chaos Emeralds, which are obtained by completing different types of special stages. You can enter them by finding these emerald boxes on different stages throughout the game if you have 50 or more rings. Finding these boxes also helps add replay value to the game. In some of these stages you get to fight against Fang, and his fights are definitely the highlight of any special stage he's in. And just look at him. He's so happy. Graphically, Triple Trouble is much better than the other Game Gear titles. Each zone has a fair amount of detail put into them that make them feel more alive. Sadly, due to hardware limitations and the game's poor performance, animations are used sparingly, with backgrounds being static, and aside from Sonic, most objects in the game aren't heavily animated. Not necessarily a complaint, just thought it's worth mentioning. Sonic also has a couple of charmful idle animations. Now when it comes to music, this game manages to deliver very decent tracks, with some exceptions such as the Sunset Park train chase track, which is honestly just amazing. Each track fits well with the atmosphere of the given stage. Even in the weakest stages of the game, the music manages to deliver. Sadly, the majority of the soundtrack doesn't really leave a lasting impact, and none of the tracks feel that memorable once the game's turned off. Both graphically and level design wise, these are the best stages the Game Gear has to offer. Much of that is thanks to the fact that Triple Trouble actually found a way to work around the limited field of view issue most classic Sonic games suffer from, by simply removing most death traps and spikes you would otherwise run into. This helps you keep rings, and while it overall removes much of the difficulty of this game's stages, it in turn makes the game more accessible and fun for players who haven't memorized map layouts or just have poor reaction time. The game has 6 zones, with each zone having 3 different acts, 2 of those being normal levels and the last one being a boss fight zone. The first zone is an improved version of Turquoise Hill from Sonic Chaos. It's a great introductory zone, giving you a lot of room to explore and making power-ups easy to find. Though the use of Green Hill lookalikes has gotten very tiring at this point, I still appreciate that they didn't just straight up reuse Green Hill here. This stage's boss fight is also the only one to take advantage of the game's mid-air spin attack, with it being necessary to defeat the first boss of the game. The boss itself is not very hard. Sunset Park is where Triple Trouble is at its peak, being the best zone in the game, and personally one of my favorite zones from the classic titles. The game makes both high speed and more exploration-minded playstyles viable and fun, with both of its acts having a lot of different paths for you to take, some of which rewarding you with different collectibles and more difficult routes. The thing about this level that really gets me though is the seamless transition into the third act, where instead of giving you a transition card, the train you're on top of starts moving while the best track in the game starts playing. The act itself isn't as interesting as it could have been, and the boss fight is deceptively simple, but the stage transition and the hype music made up for the lack of a challenging boss fight. Meta Young Lyra starts taking a different approach to level design, having overall shorter levels that are packed with alternate routes and ways to easily backtrack, encouraging you to explore each part of the level. And since the levels are fairly short, you'll rarely, if ever, find yourself lost or not knowing where to go. And the bubble things from CD are back. Isn't that fun? The boss fight here is probably the easiest in the game. I mean, the poor thing can't even make it to the second phase of the fight in one piece, as you'll be dodging his dead remains by then. Where Meta Young Lyra was a fun stage to explore, I found Robotnik Winter to be quite the opposite, being more difficult to explore without getting lost, mainly due to the layout being more confusing and sometimes just straight up blocking you from backtracking. The snowboarding parts are fun though. Now at this point, the game starts to take a nosediving quality. Tidal Plant is the mandatory underwater level in a classic Sonic game, and it's one of the worst in its already weak roster of stages. Sonic's movement underwater is incredibly slow, and the stage is overall designed to be slow, not in a fun way. On the contrary, the boss fight with Knuckles is fine, though I don't think it's really a good idea to be underwater like this. While Atomic Destroyer is a step up from Tidal Plant, I still think it has a lot of problems that drag down the experience. I previously critiqued Robotnik Winter for feeling difficult to navigate, and this zone makes that the main gimmick of the stage, with the zone just being a literal maze. And trust me, mazes and Sonic don't mix well. The stage also has some infuriating platforming you have to do on these really small blocks, with the punishment for falling being instant death. These parts of the level help highlight my biggest complaint with this game, which is that Sonic accelerates far too quickly during jumps. It wasn't a problem in previous stages because precise platforming like this wasn't present in earlier levels, but in these few instances it dragged down the enjoyment in the last zone. The game's final act is a boss rush zone where you face off against Metal Sonic and Eggman. Metal Sonic's boss fight is very easy, with him having only 2 moves to use against you, and after that you'll have a fairly challenging 3-phase boss fight against Robotnik, which ends with you taking the 6th Chaos Emerald from him, as well as his life. After that, Sonic rescues Knuckles and laughs at him for being a fucking moron. Now there's 2 ending scenes you can get. One where Fang runs off with the uncollected Chaos Emeralds if you fail to gather all of them. And if you gathered all the emeralds, you'll see Tails and Sonic flying into the sunset while the credits start to roll. In conclusion, with the obvious hardware limitations in mind, Sonic Triple Trouble is a good game with great level design, visual style, replay value, soundtrack, and unique mechanics that all make the game stand out as something unique among Sonic's cast of Game Gear games. I do still have some problems with the game. For starters, it's very short, with only 6 zones, not including the special stages, and the game is very easy, which doesn't help the short playtime at all. Game also has clearly worse performance issues than any previous Game Gear game has, which is especially noticeable when multiple animations have to play on screen. This I could only assume to be the case because of the lack of a Master System port, as this game is only available on handheld consoles. Most of the bosses weren't that interesting either. Oh boy, I sure do wish there was a fan-made remake that addressed and fixed all these issues I had with the game. Sure is a shame that doesn't exist. Stay tuned, somewhere later this month probably, for Sonic Triple Trouble 16-bit. See ya!